Today I'm going to be talking about memory interventions and mild cognitive impairment. And I'm sure this is a very savvy group, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to start out by defining what MCI, or mild cognitive impairment, is. So MCI is a transitional stage between normal healthy aging and dementia. And its criteria are that people have to have cognitive impairment in one or more domains, but to have an intact ability to do their instrumental activities of daily living and their basic activities of daily living, and to not meet criteria for dementia. Approximately 10 to 15% of the population aged 65 and older has MCI. And if you follow people with MCI over time, for example, in one of Peterson's studies, if you follow them over 6 years, 80% of them will progress from MCI to dementia over that 6-year period. So that's a rate of about 12% per year progressing to dementia. So the goal of cognitive rehabilitation is to help slow down this progression to dementia. We know with cognitive interventions that we're not changing the brain pathology. There's no direct influence on plaques or tangles or anything like that. But what we can do is raise people's level of functioning so that the time by which they are diagnosed with an impairment will be longer. We're basically pushing back the clock with cognitive interventions. So to illustrate it, it's like the MCI moving back towards closer to normal aging. So what I'm going to do today is review existing intervention studies in MCI, and I'll be doing this separately for compensatory approaches and restorative approaches, and I'll define those in a second. And then I'm going to suggest some new directions in intervention research, some new directions that are happening now in intervention research, and make some recommendations for future research. And I'll end with an example of some studies that are going on in my lab on the benefits of trial and error learning. So compensatory approaches to cognitive interventions teach people strategies to compensate for or bypass their diminished functions and minimize activity limitations. So these are not changing or restoring the cognitive impairment, but finding other strategies or works around that will improve people's functioning despite the fact that they have a cognitive deficit. And theoretically, these approaches assume functional reorganization of brain networks, so that instead of using the area of the brain that is affected by MCI, you're using other areas of the brain to do the same kind of functions in a different way. So just to give an example, this gentleman here, his name is Carol Houdon. He's at Laval University, and he does a lot of really fascinating work on memory, and including on memory in MCI. So imagine that I meet him at a conference, and I want to remember his name. Well, some strategies that I could use to compensate for my honestly poor memory for people's names are semantic processing. I can try to think about what the meaning of the name is. To be honest, I have no idea what Houdon in French last name, H-U-D-O-N, means, but I could create a meaning for it. I could create it as hood on. He has his jacket hood on. So I'm thinking about the meaning behind the name, and that will help me to remember it better. I could use visual imagery. So in fact, when I think of Carol Houdon, I think of he's a Christmas caroler, and he's outside in the cold caroling to me, so he has his hood on, and I picture him at my door singing Christmas carols to me. That is also using association, so I'm associating the meaning that I have put onto his name with an event and with a visual image. And then I finally could use spaced retrieval, so I could say his name right away, then wait a couple of seconds before I say his name again, and then wait even longer before I say his name, a few, like say 5 or 10 seconds, and repeat it again, and then a bit longer and repeat it again. And this is a strategy that's been shown to really enhance the storage of information into long-term memory. What you're literally doing there is you're putting something into memory for a short amount of time, but pulling it right back out before it's lost, putting it in for a bit longer, and then pulling it back out. So you're training the encoding and retrieval of that information. Now, compensatory approaches don't just teach strategies usually, They are usually, first of all, they're done in groups. It's not typical to do one-on-one compensatory approaches with healthy older adults or people with MCI. And they're usually done with adjuvant education about the condition, so in this case about what MCI is, and stress management. And they are sometimes combined with psychotherapy, with cognitive stimulation, and sometimes with goal attainment. So having clients set their goals of what they'd like to achieve in the rehabilitation, and then assessing throughout how close people are getting to those goals. Just as one example of a cognitive intervention that used this compensatory approach is one that is now a clinical program at Baycrest called Learning the Ropes for MCI. And along with Angela Troyer and Kelly Murphy, I helped them to design this program back in 2008. And the way that, for developing it and testing its efficacy that it was designed, that's pretty similar today as well, is that there were 7 sessions initially, plus a follow-up booster session later on. Each session was attended both by the person with MCI and a loved one. And the first hour of the session was psychoeducational, and both party members attended, so the person with MCI and their loved one. And so we talked about things like what MCI is. We introduced the memory strategies, described what they were. We talked about the importance of relaxation and the effects of stress on memory and on the brain. We talked about, sorry, I can't see too well, how to engage in relaxation. We talked about the importance of good nutrition for cognitive health. We talked about the importance of staying cognitively and socially engaged in the community, and gave people community resources. And then in the second hour, the people with MCI and their loved ones split up, and the people with MCI learn how to do these memory strategies. So we do it by, again, introducing what the strategies are, and then they practice it over and over again in different scenarios in the classroom, and they get homework to apply those strategies in their everyday lives in the weeks in between classes. Meanwhile, the loved ones meet with social workers to talk about planning for the future and coping with their person's loved one's MCI. So those are compensatory approaches. A totally different approach to trying to remediate cognitive deficits in MCI are restorative approaches. And here you're trying to directly retrain the lost functions. So if it's memory, you're trying to directly retrain or improve memory. And it's done through repetitive practice. Usually it's individual treatment as well, so just one person usually sitting at a computer doing something over and over and over again, trying to improve it. And theoretically here, we are not trying to engage necessarily functional reorganization, but we're trying to improve the area of the brain that's been affected. Restorative approaches are also typically adaptive. That is, they start out easy, and as the person achieves mastery, they become a bit more difficult. And then once they achieve mastery at that level, it becomes a bit more difficult still. So a couple of examples are that if you were to train attention, you might repeatedly do 2 tasks simultaneously, and trying to vary the emphasis on each of the 2 tasks. So sometimes you might pay more attention to task A, other times more attention to task B, and other times try to split your attention 50-50. And you would come back a few times a week and do this for weeks and weeks on end. An example of psychomotor speed training might be that you're identifying objects on a screen as quickly as possible, and you're not sure where they're going to appear. And the speed at with which you can identify that object will determine how difficult the task is, and it'll become more difficult as you get better at it. So to assess what the current state of cognitive interventions in MCI are, I did a search of the literature, searching PubMed and PsycInfo for terms training or intervention and mild cognitive impairment. And then I looked through all of the reference lists for the articles that I found. And what I'm including in this review are studies that describe cognitive outcomes, so they measured cognition in some way, of a multiple session cognitive intervention. So I don't want just single studies that look at the effects of different variables on cognition, but there really are intervention trials. in people with MCI. And I identified a total of 46 papers. The good news is that interest in MCI interventions is rapidly rising. So this shows the cumulative count of publications that I identified that met those criteria. And you can see somewhere around 2006, 2007, interest has really taken off. After applying a few more criteria, including that they gave the data that I needed to really look at the effects of what they found, and that it was really a cognitive intervention, because when I looked deeper at some of them, it turned out to be more of a psychosocial intervention. I identified 31 studies, and these included 21 that took a compensatory approach and 10 that took a restorative approach. And what I did then is I tallied the outcomes and whether they found a positive effect or not. And I grouped these into different cognitive domains. So the first domain is global cognition, so measures like the mini-mental or the MoCA would come under global cognition, or the ADAS-Cog. A global memory measure, so a lot of people report as a total score on a memory battery that has verbal and visual memory and immediate and delayed, and they just take the total score. Other studies report more specific memory data, so we can look more specifically at whether there were improvements in verbal memory for immediately, verbal memory after a delay, visual memory immediately, visual memory after a delay, working memory, attention, psychomotor speed, executive functioning, verbal fluency, or the ease with which people can gain access to their knowledge, measures of subjective memory, so questionnaires about how people think their memory is functioning, knowledge about strategies and how to use them. And then finally, I wanted to include, because of its great impact on cognition, measures of depression or quality of life. And I lumped them together at this point, but their arguments can be made for separating them or lumping them together. And what I did, because I can't wrap my head around lots of data unless I can see it. I'm a very visual person. So the first thing I did is I made a spreadsheet where each row was a different study, each column was a different cognitive domain, and within the cells, if they measured that cognitive domain, I filled it in. And I filled it in either with a red X, representing a non-significant change after the intervention, so nothing happened, with an orange check if there was a significant improvement in the intervention group, but it was equal to the improvements in the control group. So most likely it was a practice effect, although I'll come back to a caveat about that later. I put in parentheses an X, if in blue, if the control group showed a significant decline from pre to post-intervention that was not present in the intervention group, suggesting that the intervention staved off some kind of natural decline that's occurring with MCI. And then finally, the one that we're really looking for is a green check with an asterisk beside it. So that's where they found a significantly greater improvement in the intervention group than in the control group. And what do we find? We find a royal mess, a real mess. So here we have the studies down the left and the domains across the right. And you can see there's some, but not that many, green checks. And furthermore, all of these studies included memory interventions, and we see a disappointingly low number of green check marks there. And I tried then qualitatively to see whether, well, does it have to do with the nature of the control group, whether it was an inactive control group or an active control group or a semi-active control group? Does it have to do with how many people they had in their study? Does it have to do with how many training sessions they had? And nothing really seemed to come out except possibly that Morrow et al. In 2 different papers seems to get a lot of positive effects, and she uses a lot of training sessions. But you know, it's data coming from one lab, and I don't want to say, go out and tell the world you need lots of sessions based on one lab. So it immediately became clear to me that this kind of qualitative approach wasn't going to tell me anything about how we should do cognitive interventions for MCI. And so I turned to a more quantitative approach, which is to do a meta-analysis. Now, 4 studies failed to report the data that I need to actually include them in the meta-analysis, and I've requested those data from them and still haven't received it, but I hope that they'll come through. But I used Review Manager, which if you've never used it, I've never done a meta-analysis before. I'm not a terribly quantitative kind of person. It's beautiful and easy to use, and it has great support literature, so it's quite easy to use if you're interested in doing this with something. So I looked at basically the differences in effect size between the intervention group and the control group. And I had to exclude visual memory, both immediate and delayed, because there were only a couple of studies that looked at visual memory. So I looked at all of the other domains where they had at least 3 outcome points, which is still quite low to lump them together in meta-analyses. And what I found is that when you combine all of those studies together, now we do see that significantly greater effects of interventions, of these compensatory interventions, are found for the intervention group and the control group, for verbal memory, both immediately and delayed, for verbal fluency, for knowledge about strategies and how to use them, and for depression and quality of life. So just to give you a view of what that's like, here's the results for verbal immediate memory, where, so these are each of the studies or different comparisons if they have them, and you can hardly see it, but the green dot is the effect size, but then you take their error into account, and that's the width of the bar. And overall, pooled, it has a significant effect size, so the diamond here is not crossing 0, but it's still a pretty small effect, and we'll see that with the others too. Here's for verbal delayed memory, same kind of picture. Here's for verbal fluency. For strategy, knowledge, and use, a bit more variance there. The diamond's fatter there, so it suggests that there's more variability in the data. There are fewer people who measure it too. And then for depression and quality of life. So overall, and what I did next is I looked at, well, do any of those variables that I had at my table moderate the size of the effects? So I looked at whether does the number of training sessions matter, does the control group type matter, and does the sample size matter? And what I found is that in general, no. And that could be a power issue. There's still not a whole lot of studies. But the only effects that I found were on depression / quality of life, where I found that the more sessions that you have in your intervention, the bigger the benefits for reducing depression and improving quality of life. And a marginal effect that you get smaller effects on depression and quality of life if you have a stronger control group. That is an active control group that's coming and meeting the same number of times as the intervention group, but not receiving the intervention. So that is more solidly designed studies find smaller effects on depression and quality of life. So to summarize, the compensatory approaches do have beneficial effects on verbal memory, verbal fluency, strategy, knowledge, and use, and depression, quality of life. Most of these effects are small, with the exception of a medium effect size for knowledge about strategies and their use. Now you might say, you know, this is really disappointing, and in some ways I agree it is, but I want to point out that the kinds of memory tests that are used in these studies are standardized memory tests, and they're not very amenable to the application of strategies. So on like wordless learning tests, it's really difficult to use visual imagery. You can't use spaced retrieval. You don't have time because the words are being read to you very quickly. So the fact that people are learning more about strategies and know how to use them well in everyday situations bodes well. And I think we just need to have better measures of everyday memory functioning to see whether it's transferring to everyday memory functioning, because we don't honestly really care whether they get better on the CBLT or not. So the effects on depression and quality of life were dependent on the number of sessions and to some extent the control group design. So now I'm going to turn towards these restorative approaches that try to directly retrain cognitive functioning. And people have either tried to train a single process, so they're just on memory training or attention training, for example, or they've tried to train a number of different kinds of cognitive domains. And so falling in this latter camp are things like posit science and luminosity that you've heard about. And here's the table for that. Again, overall, a great disappointment. And it gets even worse when you look at the heavily outlined boxes, where that's what they trained. So Finn trained verbal delayed memory. I am working on a study that trained recollection, that I looked at outcomes that were standardized. Herrera is training visual immediate memory and attention, and so on. And what you see here is that if we get positive effects, that has bigger effects in the intervention than the control group, we're only seeing them in the thing that we're training. And they're not generalizing to other domains at all. So and we've known this for a while, that restorative approaches don't generalize well. You get better at what you do, so if you want to play brain age, you'll get better at it, but it won't necessarily generalize. So the restorative approaches as implemented so far may improve performance on a trained task, and not always, but they don't generalize well to untrained tasks in same or other domains. Now, new directions, really just kind of highlighting one of them, and that is the inclusion of imaging, neuroimaging, as a measure of intervention success. So just a couple of examples of this. First, Sylvie Belleville and her group did a group compensatory memory study, very much like what we have going with learning the ropes. But they scanned people before and after the intervention while they were learning a list of words and then recognizing them later on. And what they found was increases in the intervention group, both during encoding and during retrieval in the areas that you can see here, that were greater in those people receiving the intervention than well, it was actually a multiple baseline. So greater than from baseline to baseline, and then boom, they increased after the intervention. Hampstead et al. Has a few papers out training face name mnemonics so that people can learn the names of people better. And this is quite interesting. This is the hippocampus bilaterally, so left and right hippocampus. And what this is showing is that the changes in activation of the hippocampus that were greater in the intervention group than in the control group. And you can see that improved activation of the hippocampus bilaterally on the actual items that they were trained on. So when they saw the faces and names that they were trained on, they saw this bilateral effect. But importantly, even on stimuli that they were not trained on and had not seen before, they found increased activation in the right hippocampus in the intervention group. That was greater than the control group. So at least we're seeing here not generalization to other cognitive domains, which you wouldn't really expect necessarily with face name mnemonics, but activation and application to untrained stimuli. And people are using their brains more, basically, to achieve this. So compensatory approaches, again, have positive effects on verbal memory, fluency, strategy, knowledge, and use, and depression and quality of life. And restorative approaches improve the trade process. And both appear to alter brain activity, and importantly, in ways that are also linked to training gains. So both of those studies, too, show that the bigger the training effects, the bigger the changes in brain activity. So some directions for future research. First of all, it's absolutely time that we move beyond inactive control groups. There's really no reason, other than funding in this current climate, to include an inactive control group anymore. The problem is the inactive control group is not getting the social interactions with their peers. They're not getting just the physical activity of coming out to a control intervention. They differ in just so many ways that we really need to have active control groups. And furthermore, a number of studies are starting to show that weightless control groups, so where people do absolutely nothing, decline over the period of observation, not just due to the natural course of MCI, but there's a lot of suggestion now that they decline because they want the intervention and they're not getting it. So in one of the trials that went on at Baycrest, this happened there too, that the weightless control group and this is not necessarily MCI, but people with subjective complaints, declined in their performance quite a bit from pre to post weightless control. And we see that in a lot of these papers here as well. So that is a compound that we just don't want to have anymore. And it's time to power studies properly. A lot of the studies that had an orange check showing an equivalent improvement in the intervention and the control group, I had to put them with an orange check because they weren't powered to look at the interactive effect and the bigger effect in the intervention and the control group. And most of these studies actually tested the two groups separately with t-tests because they didn't have the power to do a 2x2 ANOVA. So to do an intervention trial and not have it powered properly is crazy. We have to do it so that we can see whether there are bigger effects in the intervention group. Time to use more sensitive outcome measures. If we're training real-life examples about how to remember when your doctor's appointment is, or how to remember the names of people at your card group, then why are we testing with the CBLT or other wordless learning measures or things like that? So I think we need to create some good measures of everyday functioning to really properly assess the benefits of cognitive interventions. Maybe inclusion of more brain activation, neuroimaging studies as a sensitive outcome measure as well. Because if we are changing the way people use their brains, we should be seeing it in terms of brain activation or maybe structure too. And it's time to use more multimodal interventions. So combining the compensatory approach with the restorative approach maybe, and including not just in psychoeducation about the importance of exercise and nutrition, but exercise and nutrition interventions as well. So the CCNA, I don't know if you've heard about that big new grant, the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging. It's funding a lot of teams who do a lot of different things, but one of them is an intervention trial for people with subjective cognitive complaints and cardiovascular risk factors. And they'll be getting both exercise and nutrition training with some cognitive training as well. So good hopes that will work out well. And time to use basic cognitive science to direct both intervention approaches, especially the compensatory approaches. So there's a whole lot of research going on about how cognition changes as a function of healthy aging and an MCI, yet that knowledge is not generally applied very well to interventions. So we know that recollection declines, we know that working memory declines, we know that associative memory declines with MCI, yet not too many of the interventions really use the full body of knowledge in creating interventions for people with these deficits. And then finally, the last example that I'll lead off with some results from my own lab is around the notion of errorless learning and whether it's the right way to go in memory interventions. So errorless learning is an approach to memory rehabilitation where the interest, so this is actually what I spoke about last time I was here, but so my older data, but the interest was sparked when a study was done by Baddeley and Wilson in 1994. And what they did is they had groups of healthy younger and older adults and people with amnesia. And they had them learn information in one of two ways. The first way, they said, I'm thinking of a word that begins with BRI. Can you guess what it is? And the participant might say, is it brim? And the experimenter would say, no, good guess, try again. And the participant would say, is it bridge? No, good guess, try again. Is it bride? No, good guess. The word I want you to remember is brick. So this is trial and error learning, where they're making a lot of mistakes or guesses before they're given the information that they're to remember. And they contrasted this with errorless learning, where they said, I'm thinking of a word that begins with MUS, and it is mustard. Remember that. So again, the first example is trial and error learning, which I'll abbreviate to TEL in the next number of slides. And the second example is errorless learning, or EL. And what they found was that in both the people with amnesia and the healthy older adults, is that their final cued recall performance, where they were given BRI and MUS and all the other word stems, and had to come up with the target word, brick or mustard, was that learning and memory was a lot better after errorless learning than trial and error learning. And what they reason is that for people with episodic memory deficits, even the mild declines experienced in healthy aging, part of what we lose is the ability to recollect whether something previously was correct or incorrect. And we go more off of familiarity and just whatever is strongest at the time. And that might be one of the incorrect responses. And so after this initial study, there's been loads and loads of research in different patient populations showing that errorless learning, by and large, at least for verbal information, leads to better learning and memory than trial and error learning. In acquired brain injury, and again, in more research in amnesia and other forms of memory impairment, Korsakoff's, healthy aging, MCI, Alzheimer's disease, and even semantic dementia in learning word meanings. And it was around this time, and I presented on one of these studies last time I was here, that I had a new graduate student start in my lab, and that's Andrea Cyr. And the first thing she said is like, hold on, this makes no sense. Errorless learning is entirely passive. You're just told what to remember and you don't do anything yourself. It's encouraging very shallow processing. It does not permit any kind of retrieval practice. You're not pulling anything out of your head you just have that word presented to you. Whereas trial and error learning is active and effortful. You have to participate in the learning process. It's encouraging deep processing, or at least deeper than errorless learning. And it's allowing learners to learn from their mistakes if they can. And so there is, in fact, a whole other literature that suggests that making mistakes should benefit memory. And that's the testing effect literature, which shows that memory is better if you attempt to retrieve something or if you're tested on it than if the information is just represented or restudied. So for example, for students trying to study for midterms, it's better to create little tests for yourself and quiz yourself than it is just to reread the textbook. And this is true even though you make errors when you test yourself or you're tested. So even if you make errors, you will learn better by trying to retrieve than restudying. And furthermore, it's especially effective if corrective feedback is given. So you test yourself, you see whether you're correct or not. If you're incorrect, you restudy the information that you're incorrect about. And furthermore, the harder the test, the bigger the benefit. So if I give you an easy multiple choice test, that'll still be better than restudying, but it won't be as good as a short answer test for your ability to learn the new information. So for example, an example of one of these testing effects studies is that of Cornell et al. In 2009. And what they did is they said, kind of sort of like this, I'm thinking of a word related to pond. Can you guess what it is? Participant might say, is it water? And they say, no good guess, the word is frog. This probably looks familiar. It's very similar to what Baddeley and Wilson did. And they contrasted it with, I'm thinking of a word related to mouse, and it is hole. Remember that. Later on, they were given the cues, pond, mouse, to recall the targets, frog, hole. And what they found over a number of studies is that people learned the target words better if they made mistakes first than if they didn't. So if it was trial and error, then errorless learning. And so what Andrea noticed is that there's a massive confound between the errorless learning literature in the clinical world and the testing effect literature in basic cognitive psychology, where, first of all, the errorless learning is tested with patients or older people, and testing effects are tested with students. But in addition to that, the clinical errorless learning literature uses lexical error generation. It's always word stems or very shallow kinds of things like that. I'm thinking of a word that begins with BRI, whereas the testing effect literature is conceptual error generation. I'm thinking of a word related to pond in that semantic category. And so what we think is happening here is that when you get a conceptual cue, I'm thinking of a flower, can you guess what it is? That cue will activate the errors that you generate. That's the only way that you would generate them. And the errors that you generate are related to each other, so they'll kind of co-activate each other. And then once you get the target word, the cue and target will be co-activated. They'll be related to each other in working memory. But moreover, we think that there are links between the errors that you generate and the target. So you're mentally linking up the errors that you made with the target. And the way that we think of it is that they become stepping stones back to the target. And that's why you remember the target better than if those errors are not there. By contrast with, and that's why you get a better memory advantage for trial and error learning than errorless learning. By contrast with lexical learning, the word stem will activate the errors that you generate. And when the target is provided, the word stem will activate the target. But the errors don't activate each other. They're not related to each other in any meaningful way except their first couple letters, and they're not related to the target. All they do effectively is create noise and interference. And that's why you get better memory after errorless learning than trial and error learning with these kinds of lexical conditions. So that's our theory, but of course we had to test it. And so we asked, do you get a dissociation between lexical and conceptual error generation for both young and old? So do you get an errorless learning effect with lexical cues, but a trial and error effect or benefit for conceptual cues? And how does it work? What is it about these conceptual errors that make them beneficial? And so I'm going to give you an example of one study. There's a few others that I'll just tell you the results of. So in one study, she tested 64 healthy younger adults and 64 healthy older adults who were all native English speakers or learned English at a young age. They had no major medical or psychiatric conditions affecting cognition. And furthermore, they passed the TICS, which is like a over-the-phone mini-mental. And then once they came in, we made sure that they passed the real mini-mental and that they didn't show symptoms of depression or anxiety on the HADS, the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale. So they did what I just told you. So they did either conceptual learning or lexical learning. And every person did learn some targets by trial and error learning and other targets by errorless learning in both conditions. And what we found is what we expected, is that in the conceptual condition, final memory, cued recall for those targets was better after trial and error learning than errorless learning. And that was true for both younger and older adults. Whereas memory for the targets was better after errorless than trial and error learning in the lexical condition. Again, true for both groups. The effects were a little bit stronger for the young adults than for older adults, but we've seen it go the other way other times too. We also not only gave them the cues, like BRI, what was the target, we also then afterwards asked them, what were your errors that you generated? Because if these errors in the conceptual case are really stepping stones, then you should be able to remember them. What people will tell us is that when they see the cue of flower at the test, they say, well, I know I thought it was tulip, then I thought it was rose. No, it was daisy, which suggests that they are going back through them to get back to the target. And so when we asked them for what their memory for the errors, what we found is that in the conceptual condition, the vast majority of the time, both younger and older adults could remember both of the errors that they had generated. Or for the older adults, at least one of the errors. And it was very rare that they could not remember their errors at all. By contrast, in the lexical condition, it was a lot more likely that they couldn't remember what errors they had generated. And for older adults in particular, the likelihood of them, so this is if they remember the target, could they remember their errors? They were less likely to remember both of their errors than they were to remember none or only one, suggesting that in the lexical condition, remembering your errors actually interferes and makes it less likely that you're going to remember the target. Whereas in the conceptual condition, remembering your errors, they're helpful and you're more likely to remember the target. So yes, we do see a dissociation in both young and older adults where lexical kind of conditions like that Baddeley and Wilson used and that whole host of papers I showed you before, you get an errorless learning benefit. It's better to prevent errors in those kind of conditions than to let people make errors. But for conceptual conditions, it's actually better if people make errors. They'll be more likely to remember the correct information if they're allowed to make errors along the way. What makes these conceptual errors beneficial? The error data provides some evidence that they serve as stepping stones back to the target, But in other studies too, we've shown that they improve recollection, so memory for an item in its context, and they improve source memory compared to errorless learning. And they also improve processing of the feedback when you're told, nope, good guess, try again, or yes, that was right. People process that feedback better when they make conceptual errors, and not when they make lexical. So just what this implies is that the neuropsychological literature has long embraced errorless learning, but this research turns this viewpoint on its head and shows that conceptual errors can benefit memory. They can serve as stepping stones towards better learning for both younger and older adults. And what we're doing now is seeing whether this holds true in people with MCI. My hunch is that it will, but it'll be diminished compared to healthy older adults. And that is because of Carol Houdan's research, the guy I showed you at the beginning, who has shown that semantic processing and semantic memory is reduced in MCI. So if this whole benefit of trial and error learning in conceptual conditions rests on a good semantic network, and if that's diminished in MCI, those conceptual errors should be less beneficial than for healthy older adults. So just to sum up, it's time to design better interventions, to mix compensatory and restorative approaches, to have trials that have active control groups, and to base the intervention on cognitive and neuroscience. And it's important to get this right, because as we know from the Rising Tide report, that itself is getting a little old now, that over a 10-year period, delaying dementia onset in Canadians, 65 and older, by just 2 years, not preventing it from happening, but just delaying everybody by 2 years, they get it 2 years later, would reduce the incidence of dementia by almost 30,000, would reduce the prevalence by 137,000, and would reduce healthcare costs by $14.4 billion, and total economic burden by $24.2 billion. So even if with these cognitive interventions we're not changing the pathology, if we can improve functioning for 2 years in people, it would have these kinds of benefits. So it's definitely time to try to get it right. So finally, I want to thank agencies that have funded this work over the years, and the graduate students and research assistants and summer students who have helped out with the study.
I have one quick question from the audience that was asked a little while ago,
Okay.
and that's whether or not the slides would be available. So I didn't know if they were saying that the tables are a touch small.
Yeah, they are,
Hard to
especially
read.
those. Yeah.
So I didn't know how you felt about making them available.
Yeah, I could do that. Yeah,
okay.
the meta-analyses of qualitative and quantitative is not published yet, but that's still fine because anybody could go out there and put it together. So yeah.
Okay, great. I'll just ask people to email here at the Institute, and I can send them out after.
Sure, it's on your desktop, so.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Any
thank you very much. It was excellent. I'm here as probably more as a family member. Having my mom passed away almost 3 years ago from vascular dementia, and a current family member who may be MCI may be in the picture.
Yeah.
What I'm finding to be, may I just clarify, executive functions include judgment and,
Yeah, it's a huge umbrella.
Yes.
It includes multitasking, inhibiting irrelevant information, but it includes the more behavioral side. Judgments.
Doing things, not doing things. And I'm finding that to be much more troubling as a change than straight memory.
Yeah.
Particularly in someone whose memory for names and faces wasn't great to begin with, and acknowledge that all through life.
Yeah.
But it's issues of judgment, like leaving the front door, the back door unlocked and going out. or turning the burner on and not turning it off.
Do you think that's judgment, or is that an intentional or memory problem, not remembering that the back door is unlocked or the burner is on?
Well, the reason the burner is on is heating one's coffee cup as the coffee's brewing, putting one ceramic coffee cup on the electric burner and turning it to low each day to heat the cup, rather than just like nuking the cup with some water in it or putting hot water in it. It's putting the ceramic mug directly on the burner to heat it up. It's things like that that are much more risky or troubling than just not remembering that you saw that film 5 or 10 years ago or 20 years ago or last year. So it's those type of decisions or lack of decisions that are so I don't mean to set aside all of your research and everyone's research, but how might I and who is studying that kind of thing? Do you know?
There are,
or how to and may I say that this person passed Mini-Mental has passed all of the tests. The objective test has gone to, and therefore feels that it's a complete pass, that I'm fine. And yet, this is becoming more and more of an issue of judgment and activities.
Has this person just been assessed by GP or had a full neuropsychological?
Neuropsychological. And and was told, I think, well, because of the objective tests, and even though I have spoken to these medical practitioners in psychiatry and all, therefore my concerns have been not given weight, and so therefore, so it's a difficult situation. I'm my area is museums, so I'm a lay person medically or psychologically, and yet it's hard to get support when someone has passed all the tests on people.
And that can often happen as well when people are really high functioning.
And is also back working on contracts. High functioning. Yes.
So
from retirement.
So
I don't mean to burden you with that.
No,
issue.
absolutely not.
It's just that
I guess the type of MCI that I was focusing on was the amnestic, but there are other varieties. There's executive MCI, and there's then you can have amnestic or not in single or multiple domain, and they not perfectly, but they often lead to different conditions. So the amnestic most often will lead to Alzheimer's, but other forms can be due to or lead to other things. So with judgment, it could be a lot of things. It could be vascular in origin. That's possible still if the frontal lobes were
hypertension. Something in the picture.
And then also something that if I was seeing somebody, I'd want to rule out is frontal temporal dementia, because that's where you get the behavioral changes. It's not necessarily that at all, but that would be something that would be a differential diagnosis. And there, people will test fine on neuropsychological tests, but they will engage in inappropriate behaviors sometimes, or just make rash decisions, like gamble lots of money away when they never did that kind of thing
some
before.
financial decisions that are.
But they'll pass neuropsychological tests of executive functioning usually. So there, I think in that case, I'd go back and push back to see geriatric neurologist who has that expertise, and toot Bay Crest Horn. My memory clinic is fantastic.
I can document some of this.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm trying not to come across as paranoid, but yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sorry, we had another question from the online group, and that is, has anyone looked at individual learning styles with the errorless learning and the trial and error? So were individual learning styles looked at all? Or?
Not, I don't think anybody has before. So I'm not sure if that person means whether they prefer errorless or trial and error learning, because some people do hate making mistakes. There's a bit of a personality thing. We've tried looking at that. We've included personality measures, and have not really seen any strong associations, but we have pretty small group sizes. And at some point, Andreanne wanted to look at, you can just as easily give negative feedback as you can positive too, so she kind of altered if people were told, you're correct when they were correct, or you're wrong but not told when they were correct, and that didn't seem to make a difference either overall, but it's probably because some people react okay to negative feedback, and that encourages them to try harder. Other people are devastated by it, and we had a mix of everything probably in there. So it could mean that, or it could mean visual versus verbal learning, and that has not been done. We've done, some of our studies have been more visual than verbal, so we just finished one where we wanted to know, do errors still help if you're really out in left field? If your guess is way off base, are they still helpful? And the way that we did that is we showed a picture of a homograph kind of word. We showed the word, like bank, and then they would guess, is it money? And then we would show them a picture that was either something to do with money or banks or something like that. And we'd say yes. Or we'd show them a picture of a river, so a riverbank. So that way we could either show them a picture that was consistent with their guess or the complete different meaning from their guess. And there it does seem to be the case that these errors are more beneficial if they're close, if you're in the right ballpark, and less beneficial if you're out in left field. So that was kind of visual. There were pictures, and there's a word cue in the picture, but we haven't, and I don't think anybody has directly compared verbal and visual errorless and trial and error learning.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
She was talking about visual learning and auditory.
Okay, all right. That's usually what people mean when they say learning styles.